Hello and welcome to my art blog. Today I'm going to study some of the works of an incredible watercolor artist called GEGYjiji. They make these deceptively simple looking pieces that usually feature still moments from everyday life. I love the way they paint. Their ability to use watercolor is phenomenal and they're so good with their lights and shadows. My main use of watercolor is when I'm urban sketching or travel sketching. I've only been using watercolor continuously for less than a year, and I know there's much more that I can do with the medium beyond what I do with urban sketching. Usually with urban sketching, I just lay down the base layer of paint and then add shadows and highlights. I don't do any complicated blending or layering, which is perfectly fine when you're on the go and need to work fast, but when I'm painting at home, I have the time to spend mixing and layering paints. Even though these pieces are painted to look realistic, they don't really lose that almost dreamlike quality to watercolor. These paintings also feel like daily observations of the world around the artist. In a pinned Q&A on their Instagram page, they answered a question about their art style by saying their style is based on their personality. Just like some people will be more lively, some people will be more quiet. And I think that really highlights what I love about these paintings. There is a sense of peace within them. They are tranquil. They're not trying to be flashy or eye-catching. They are just observations in stillness, and they invite you to sit down and find a moment to take it all in. The way the artist plays with light and shadow is my favorite aspect to their paintings. That sharp contrast between dark and light adds so much visual interest to a piece and really sets the tone of the painting. I want to improve my watercolor skills, so I'm going to be studying a couple of these paintings closely and see if I'm able to learn something and use some of these techniques in my own paintings. We're going to start with this piece. It looks so simple, but there's so much intentionality to the composition. The plant is clearly the main subject. It's the one the eye is immediately drawn to. But the reason it's so eye-catching is because it is literally being highlighted. It is entirely in the light, and the shadows falling behind it almost act as a frame to keep the plant in focus. The rest of the background is also painted in grays and shadows, which means the main pop of color is only on the plant. The bright red of the leaf is so vibrant against the duller colors. I also really like the shadow being cast by the cycle that's off screen on the right. You know it's there because of the tire, but because of the way the shadows fall, you can also see the mesh of the basket as it leans against the wall. What this also does is cover up some of the bright light falling on that side of the wall. It could distract the viewer from the focus of the painting because it would have also been an area of bright light that drew the eye. Even though this is a simple painting, there is so much thought that goes into the composition. Another thing to notice is the shadows across the ground. Even though they are supposed to be cast shadows from the plant and the pillar on the right, the shadows themselves are not one uniform shadow color. I didn't notice this at first, but if you look closely, you'll see that the shadows are not really dark. They're reflective. It almost looks like water because it's just reflecting the door that's above it, but when you glance at the painting, it reads like it's a shadow. Again, it adds to the framing of the plant. The decision to make it appear like a reflection allows the shadow to continue that framing effect and box the plant in. That's such an interesting technique. I don't think I've noticed anything like this on other watercolor paintings, and maybe that's just because I haven't looked closely enough, but it's such an interesting way to add darks to your work without them being truly dark. I smeared the paint here, unfortunately. I didn't mean to do that, but it's my hand rubbed against it, and so now all the shadows are wonky. I tried to replicate this work as closely as possible, and I think I did a decent job. I was able to capture the overall vibe of the painting, and I had a really fun time playing around with the shadows. While painting, I was trying to keep all aspects of my painting as close to the original as possible, but now that I've finished it, it's actually easier for me to see the differences and notice even more details that I missed originally. As you can probably tell, I still need to work on my water control. In this wall and the window, for example, you can see that the paints have bloomed. This is a common effect that happens when the paints dry unevenly, leaving some spots with more water than others. I don't really mind it in this case because I don't think it takes anything away from the overall painting, but clearly water control is something I need to work on. I was also a little bit impatient with the reflective shadows. The lines here are not as clean and crisp as they are in the original piece. I'd say they look more like suggestions of a reflection instead of an actual reflection. What I'm also realizing now is the colors I've used are a touch more vibrant than the ones in the original painting, and that's something you'll see better in the next piece. In this piece, GEGYjiji uses slightly muted colors that skew warmer, so there's a very cozy golden feel to the painting. The colors I've used are a touch on the colder side, so they do not have the same warmth as the original. I didn't actually notice this while I was painting, but comparing the two now, it's easier to see. Also, the wheel of the bike is floating. It's not touching the ground. The second piece I tried to replicate is this one of the shadow of branches falling across a window. I loved the original piece. The shadows are done so well that I can practically hear the leaves rustling on the breeze. This dappled effect of sunlight poking through the branches is so beautiful, and if you look closely at the shadows themselves, you'll see that there's a light glow to them. Especially on the window frame, the shadows are not just dark, but have pops of yellow and blue to make it look bright and more visually interesting. Even on the window panes, there are layers of darker and lighter shadows, giving us an idea of distance and the layers of branches that go beyond what's visible in the painting. It is such a warm and cozy piece, and I struggled to replicate it. I genuinely thought this would not be more complex than the previous piece, but the two things I need to get better at are very prevalent in this painting: water control and patience. To bring back a point that I made earlier, the colors in this painting are also slightly less saturated than my own, and the colors all lean a bit warmer. This is easiest to see on the cherry blossom tree. The color of my cherry blossoms is more vibrant than the soft, dreamy color that GEGYjiji has on theirs. I tried to make something close, but I was not able to get that warm, subtle pink. It's probably worth mentioning that the palette I use is the Winsor & Newton Cotman Pocket Plus watercolor set, which comes with the standard warm and cool yellow, red, magenta, warm and cool blue, warm and cool green, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, black, but I've replaced it with Payne's Grey, and white gouache. This is the first watercolor set that I bought when I started painting about a year ago. I think for a beginner, this is a wonderful palette. It's got all the primaries plus a few extra that make it easier to mix certain colors. However, more experienced artists will curate palettes of their own, and those can include colors that are more suited to the type of paintings that they tend to do more often. So in the case of GEGYjiji, maybe they have a more muted palette with slightly warmer colors that works for the type of painting that they do. This is speculation, of course. I don't know what their palette looks like, I'm just guessing. But once again, the colors I'm using are cooler than the ones from the original painting. I am also not great at painting foliage. I think GEGYjiji has done a fantastic job of giving the impression of cherry blossom petals on the branches, but I did not have the patience or care to paint them in so meticulously. This is a detriment because the flowers I drew look more like blobs on the branches rather than soft and delicate petals. And finally, the shadows. This is where water control comes in. You can see there are places that look kind of blotchy because the water dried faster than I was able to lay down more paint. So it doesn't have that smooth, clean texture of the shadows from the original piece. The shadows on the painting are all done with impeccable water control so that they look like one harmonious streak of shadow. I do think I've learned a lot from doing these studies, and I want to try and paint something on my own using what I've learned. So I went outside and snapped a few photos that I could use as reference. The one I chose to paint is this. It's quite a simple composition. The subject of the photo is clearly the door, and it's framed on both sides by tall bushes. I really like the shadow falling over the piece. It's quite strong and there's a very nice contrast with the sunlight. There's also a bit of visual interest with the glass, as you can see through to the other side. I think that part is going to be complicated to paint, but we'll see how well I can do that. Once again, I had no patience while drawing the leaves. I tried to add a bit more definition to them than I did with the cherry blossoms, and I don't think it's too bad, but they're definitely not as meticulous or detailed as they might be in GEGYjiji's work. I don't know how evident it is, but I really tried to manage my water control in this piece, especially with the shadows. The shadows here are a little blotchy because I tried to make them glow a bit and it didn't really work out to the effect that I wanted. Here is the finished piece. I quite like it. I think the effect from the photo has been captured pretty well. I tried to keep the highlights quite light and the darks dark enough to have real contrast. Painting the glass was harder than I expected. I did know it would be tricky, but I couldn't figure out how to get that effect of a reflection plus transparency. Right now, it just looks like the door opens to more cobbled path and then grass before reaching some vague structures in the distance. It doesn't really feel like we're partly looking at a reflection and partly at what's behind the door. My biggest gripe, however, is with the paper. This is not great quality watercolor paper. When you're using good quality watercolor paper, you can layer paints on top of each other without lifting the layer underneath. Because this is not good quality watercolor paper, you can see that the dark blue that I put down to give it the look of glass kind of smudges the layer underneath. It bleeds a little into the colors already on the page and the effect comes off kind of muddy and not crisp. The same thing happened with the edges of the door. When I went over the spot with my shadow color, it completely blurred the lines I put down before. Other than that, I think this is a nice piece. Again, there's aspects of it that I need to work on, making the lights pop and making the shadows glow, for example. But I think I've learned a lot from doing this artist study and I'm excited to use some of what I've learned in my own paintings. If you're interested in GEGYjiji's work, please check them out on Instagram. I'll leave the link in the description and I'll see you all next time. Bye!